Protesters in Greece accused the EU of turning Europe into a fortress after a deadly migrant shipwreck left at least 78 dead and hundreds missing.
The US says despite Moscow's propaganda, Ukraine has a lot of firepower left to conduct a counter-offensive against Russia.
Donors in Brussels pledged €9.6 billion in aid to Syrian people, falling just short of the amount asked by the United Nations.
Thousands of people demonstrated in major cities across Greece over the shipwreck of a migrant boat in the Ionian Sea on Wednesday, which left at least 78 people dead and hundreds missing. The protesters accuse Greece and the EU of turning Europe into a fortress and the Mediterranean into a sea of the dead. Greek authorities have arrested 9 Egyptian nationals who were on board the ship on charges of human trafficking. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says stronger action must be taken at the European level.
Let's be clear, this is not a Greek problem. This is a European problem. I think it's time for Europe to be able, in solidarity, to define an effective migration policy for this kind of situations not to happen again.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz described the incident as devastating and said leaders must do everything in their power to prevent it from happening again. Photographs of the ship taken by the Greek Coast Guard before the tragedy show hundreds of people crammed on board. The 30-metre-long fishing vessel is said to have departed from the Egyptian coast and called at Libya before setting sail for Italy.
The Ukrainian counter-offensive is meeting strong resistance from Russian troops. Casualties are heavy and the advance is slow. Still, Kyiv claims on Thursday to have regained control of some 100 square kilometres of territories. At the end of a meeting on the contact group in support of Ukraine in Brussels, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says that Ukraine still has a lot of firepower left to conduct a counter-offensive.
I think the Russians have shown us that same 5 vehicles about 1,000 times from 10 different angles. But quite frankly, the Ukrainians still have a lot of combat capability, combat power.
The chief of the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, visited the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant on Thursday to check on the potential risks caused by the destruction of the Kakhovka dam.
I would say there are 2 elements, basically. On the one hand, we can see that the situation is serious, the consequences are there, and they are real. At the same time, there are measures that are being taken to stabilize the situation.
These images show Ukrainian servicemen firing German howitzers near Bakhmut. Together with the Netherlands, Germany has sent 14 of the self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine.
German, American, Swedish and Japanese aircraft crisscrossing over European skies. Some experts argue that NATO might be using these exercises to signal to Russia we are here and we are ready, adding fuel to its anti-alliance rhetoric. According to Moscow, the West and NATO in particular are responsible for the war in Ukraine.
Войну, которую они начали в 2014 году, мы попытались прекратить вооруженным способом. Когда немцы говорят, вот вы начали войну, вот Путин нам агрессор. Нет, это они агрессоры.
In 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron denounced NATO's lack of commitment to collective defence and went as far as saying the alliance is, quote, brain dead. But the war in Ukraine has changed all that. Germany has agreed to send tanks, while Finland and Sweden have renounced their historic neutrality. However, partners don't agree on one issue: Ukraine's integration into NATO.
NATO needs to look at what may happen after the war, so looking at also potential membership of Ukraine in NATO, but also it's about stabilization and thinking about, of course, what may happen after the war, so thinking about recovery mechanism, and I think it is, of course, long-term perspective.
Rather than immediate integration, several alliance members such as France and Poland want to negotiate greater security guarantees for Ukraine. For Paris and Warsaw and all other members, the priority is to win the war.
The most urgent task now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation. Because unless Ukraine prevails and can continue as a democratic state in Europe, there is no membership issue to be discussed at all.
A subject that will likely be at the heart of the NATO summit in Vilnius on the 11th and 12th of July.
Donors in Brussels are pledging €9.6 billion in loans and grants to people in Syria, as well as refugees in the surrounding area. The money is meant to help 15 million people inside the embattled country, as well as those neighbouring countries hosting Syrian refugees, which themselves are in a dire economic situation. But the amount falls just short of the €10.1 billion asked for by the United Nations in a humanitarian appeal at the 7th conference of its kind, held in the Belgian capital.
This is a crisis that actually affects, of course, the people concerned, but also all the neighbouring countries and the rest of the world. We have to support the resilience of communities, basic services, the local economy, in a way that makes it possible for people to uphold their agency.
The earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria in February has only served to worsen the crisis, and local NGOs on the front line say they cannot cope. Euronews spoke to one that's operating in the rebel-held northwestern area, where 1,200 volunteers are trying to help young women and children. They're also running 2 maternity wards and 2 hospitals for primary care.
We need the flexible funding that we can mobilize and utilize immediately when we have disasters. We have to keep our capacity for the emergency response, the security situation, especially with having any expected military operation is something like making the life harder and harder. And we have to take a lot of measures.
Of the 6.8 million Syrians that left the country, around 5 million are not so far from home. Turkey is hosting more than 3 million refugees, with the rest spread mainly over Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq and Egypt. The leaders of these countries are increasingly talking about sending them back home. One argument is that there's no prospect for a viable political alternative to the current Syrian regime, particularly since the Arab League readmitted President Assad in May after being expelled when the civil war began in 2011.
If Syria's neighboring countries move from words to deeds and start repatriating Syrian refugees after hosting them for more than 10 years, it's likely there will be changes in the migration flows. Instead of going back home, Syrian refugees might try to get a safe haven elsewhere, and Europe is a likely destination. Isabel Marques da Silva, Euronews, Brussels.
The European Commission says it will no longer use mobile phone services linked to Chinese tech giants Huawei and ZTE over security concerns. Under pressure from Washington, Brussels has been mulling the move to exclude the companies which are accused of enabling Chinese spying activities. The Commission is now calling on member states to formalise a ban.
We cannot afford to maintain critical dependencies that could become a weapon against our interest. That would be too critical a vulnerability and too serious a risk to our common security.
The US, the UK and Canada have already taken similar action against Chinese telecoms businesses. EU countries were divided and had been trying to come up with a common position for the past 3 years. But most have now adopted Brussels' approach. Beijing denies its tech firms pose a security risk.
Tired, but smiling. Pope Francis has been discharged from Rome's Gemelli Hospital 9 days after having surgery for an abdominal hernia and scarring. He was swarmed by a cloud of bodyguards, journalists and devotees on his short walk to the vehicle that was to take him to the Vatican. The 86-year-old pontiff, who suffers from numerous health issues, had resumed work from the hospital after his 3-hour operation was completed without complications. Francis was admitted to Gemelli Hospital in March after suffering from acute pneumonia. He also underwent colon surgery in the same hospital in 2021 and was discharged 10 days later, although his convalescence was much longer. A 5-year-old boy has been killed in Rome after a Lamborghini SUV crashed into a small family car during a YouTube challenge on Wednesday evening. The SUV was allegedly driven by members and creators of the YouTube channel The Borderline, who were attempting to drive for 50 hours straight. The victim's mother and 3-year-old sister, who was also severely injured, were also on board. The Borderline YouTube channel has more than 600,000 subscribers, and its videos have received millions of views. From Rodin to Deschamps, Leroy to Richier, nearly 250 works of art belonging to perhaps France's best-known living actor Gerard Depardieu will be auctioned in Paris in September. The Golden Globe winner is set to sell much of his art collection, which is expected to fetch between 3 to 5 million euros.
Ce sont des œuvres d'art qui, chez lui, s'empilent les unes à côté des autres. Il aime jouer d'ailleurs avec cet empilement, puisque aucune des œuvres chez Gérard Depardieu ne sont accrochées au mur, donc c'est quelque chose de très singulier.
Depardieu, who has completed over 250 films in a career spanning 6 decades, was accused of sexual violence by 13 people in April. The 74-year-old is also under investigation for the suspected rape and sexual assault of an actress in 2018. He denies any wrongdoing. The auctioneer said he hopes people will make a distinction between the accusations and the quality of the collection.